So what we're going to do is we're going to review this machine in a practical sense. So that way we can apply what we talked about last week and put it into adaptations that we want. I think when we're talking about exercise machine analysis, the most practical thing we can do after we learn about the machines is go, okay, once we learn about this machine, how can I leverage what it's good at and what it's not good at to help get the adaptations that I want? And in my experience with talking about this stuff with students since, for 10 years in some degree, the challenge really is, okay, great, that's really cool. That's a very tough exercise to learn about this machine. What do I do with it? And that's what I want to try to do today is we can take what we learned about this and talk about some creative, practical examples of what we can do with this. And frankly, your imagination is really going to be the limitations as far as how far you can take this thing. So I'll share some ideas that I like to do personally and with clients, but really your imagination and your knowledge will be what will allow you to take this further and be more creative with other clients. Because if any of you have taken any biomechanics thought process stuff, either through this or any other form, you'll know that the amount of options and the amount of demographics people will see will be endless. So here's my choose your adventure section that I would say for you guys, and I will let Anna and Michelle choose. Do you guys, would you like to talk about pulleys today and review pulleys, single, half, and double pulleys, and set up the dynamometer and talk some about that friction stuff I may have alluded to last week? Or would you like to do another machine analysis and do the compound row and do the same two universe comparison scenario where we talk from the weight stack all the way to the handles? We're going to do the other one next week no matter what, but what gets you guys excited to finish off 2020? Anna, what are you thinking? You want to talk about pulleys or you want to talk more about machines? I'm happy to do either.
I would rather do machines, to be honest.
Machines? Okay. Michelle, your machines too?
Okay, that's great.
Cool. All right. We will be doing pulleys in review next week, but I promise that it will be, again, applicable. Oh, not next week, because next week's the business study group, but the next exercise study group that we will do will be pulleys related. Okay. So brief overview. We spent the whole last video that is up on the Teams network talking about this machine. So I'm not going to talk too much about very many specifics or break down this. We'll spend that time on the compound row on the other side of this room. The thing that we did see with this machine is if I set up, oh, my dynamometer's over here, pardon me. If I set up the dynamometer onto this machine, is that generally speaking, what we were seeing, if we are able to maintain a 90-degree angle to the lever, we're going to maintain a tangential force to this system, that we did see that basically this machine drops off. So what I mean by that is at this point, if I have 35 pounds on this bit and I pull on this, the 35 pounds at this point is 22 pounds. And if I come all the way down to the bottom and I hold it down here, maintaining that tangential angle, it is now 14 pounds LBF. So in short, right, we could take the time to do an exercise machine analysis, which we will do on the other machine. But that's why I like, if you're just wanting to learn the quick and dirty, what's going on with this machine, we have this dynamometer that's showing us it's getting lighter as we get down to the bottom of this exercise. So it's getting easier as we get to a shortened position, which in our very basic practical overview works pretty well if we want an exercise machine that lines up with the strength profile of our muscles. Because if I'm going to do something like this, I'm reached up all the way, I'm in a lengthened position, and I come all the way down to a shortened position of my shoulder extensors and lats. We know as those muscles get to a shortened position, their ability to generate force and manage tension decreases. So this is kind of cool. This is a really neat machine if we want a balanced scenario. Now, very brief overview. You guys may have heard me talk about through this or in the podcast, Arthur Jones. You don't have to learn, I'm not a good Arthur Jones-ite, but Arthur Jones is the man who developed Nautilus, and he is the guy who commercialized the cam, those big round oblong things we're talking about, like this system here. And the whole idea he was trying to do was he was talking about how if you do barbell exercises strictly, the barbell is inherently limited only in that it is 100% based off of distance from your joint and gravity. The example and the reason why he developed the pullover machine initially was He came from a bodybuilding world, and he was trying to do that barbell pullover exercise where you're laying on your back. You're holding onto a bar, laying onto your back, and you reach all the way up overhead, then you come back down. What initiated his development of these machines was he wanted to create what he called the smart man's dumbbell, or the smart man's barbell. I don't like the way he named it, but with the barbell, and he was doing the pullover, when you're in this position, if you got gravity pulling back this way, you are in a very weak position from the shoulder extensors perspective. They are completely lengthened. You are at the end range joint position. And as you go to a more mid-range position of the shoulder extensors, there's almost no force. In fact, once you come past 90 degrees, it turns into a shoulder flexion exercise because now the forces are going down towards you, and you have to use everything on the front. So if you're using the pullover exercise for pec development, shoulder extensor development, like they used to talk about, it's relatively ineffective because you're only challenging one position, which is some of the qualms that you'll hear about in other programs talking about free weight squats, free weight deadlifts, free weight bench presses, free weight rows, all these things in that, which there's some advantage to this, so I'm not poking at it, but it only provides resistance in one point of the, provides very high resistance at one point of the exercise, and the rest is kind of dropping off. And so what we're seeing in most scenarios, like if we did this, a chin up on the other side of the room, you'll see that if I were to do a chin up, the distance from my joints, it's getting further and further away until we get to 90 degrees. And then it starts to actually come a little bit closer towards me, but I still have a tremendous amount of force in a very shortened position, which means that you're really only challenging at a high level the weakest spot. And so barbell squats, free weight squats, and again, there's value to this, and we're going to talk about that now. But if you're doing a free weight squat, there is not a lot of resistance when you're standing. When you get down to the bottom position, the exercise of a barbell squat is really, can you manage the bottom position? Which has advantages from both hypertrophy perspectives and strength perspectives, some advantages. So when we come into this machine, I'm going to really overarch the adaptations into three simple categories just for today. I'm going to talk about hypertrophy, I'm going to talk about strength, and then we're going to talk about what I'll call just endurance. And really, you could call it skeletal muscle endurance or conditioning, if you will. I think those are just easiest three categories to start with this. And what's really neat about this machine, or machines that have matching profiles, they are really good at helping to build conditioning of muscle. Okay, some of the advantages that we have is if we have a client who is an older client or someone who's more sensitive, perhaps they have a broken part like myself, injured back right now, whatever it may be, you get all of this great support and restraint that takes other pieces out of the equation to allow you to focus on just the upper extremity. Why I would say this is a great machine for working on endurance, it takes a lot of fortitude to control the entire range of the exercise with a matching profile. It takes a lot. If you have someone who's going at a controlled tempo, now I'm gonna have it at a pretty light weight, so please bear with me today. But if you have someone who's going at a relatively controlled tempo and it's heaviest where they're strongest and it's getting lighter as they get weakest, you have, relatively speaking, a close to one-to-one relationship between the machine and the human, which means that the human is constantly being challenged. Arthur Jones believed, and I am looking into investing into Moxies and a few other resources to try and practice doing some research with this. But at this point of my understanding of mechanics, I don't know if a matching profile exercise is actually going to be the most beneficial as a primary exercise for developing strength and developing hypertrophy, because the demand is so consistent that you never really get a chance to recover things like ATP. In the podcast, you may hear me say very quickly as a soundbite, you lose substrates, right? What kind of substrates are we talking about? Calcium, sodium, the ATP, ADP, all these things need to be able to back into the muscle, so that way, and oxygen, frankly, to be able to make sure that that skeletal muscle can continue to perform. It's much like if you do a matching profile exercise like this, your skeletal muscle is a sponge, and you're taking that sponge and you're squeezing it, you're squeezing it, you're squeezing it, and you never really let that sponge absorb really too much fluid back into the sponge. Now, I am saying that I do believe that if you're going to use this
Darn.
Oops.
I am saying, there we go. I am saying that this exercise, if we're going to use it primarily as a hypertrophy exercise, there are certainly ways that you can do that. And I will like to talk about a few things that I like to do. But I think that if you match it perfectly for the profile to the human, it could be very exhausting. Now, if you have a well-conditioned individual, like any one of us, that wants to grow muscle or get stronger, you could use a machine like this to help build up your body's ability to manage forces for a long period of time, because you do have that matching profile. Since it is stressful in a different way, and there's no really recovery for those muscles if it is a perfectly matching profile, right? That squeezing of a sponge for well-conditioned individuals, what a great thing as a part of a periodization or a program to go, okay, I'm not gonna do strength right now. I'm not going to do hypertrophy things. I'm going to pick all exercises that have perfectly matching profiles to try and exhaust my skeletal muscles of substrates and really exhaust all the options that my muscles have available, almost forcing them to require more substrates to be stored there. And there are some people that might call this sacroplasmic hypertrophy, because the sacroplasmic reticulum around the muscle is pulling more things in to be prepared for stress. I'm not sure if I would hang my hat on that. Ultimately, you're increasing the demand on those muscles, making them need more support. So when they go back to that exercise next time, they have more available, which is one of the reasons why I would say I think these are great endurance or conditioning building exercises. In deconditioned individuals, if you and most of us nowadays, well, if you're here, and Michelle, I believe you guys as well, and many of the people that are a part of the study group, if you have people who are less healthy, which I do believe should be our target market. I mean, like one of the gentlemen I see very often, you'll see some of the photos, Manny's the white-haired South Asian individual. He's 78 years old. He is absolutely in no way really making progress per se. And I don't mean to say it like that, like he's not moving forward. He's getting a little better at each time, but our main objective, as Jacques would say, is maintenance is progress. And with these older individuals, I would say over the age of 65, if you've had clients for, this is one of the things that I would say myself and a few others here, and I'm sure more experienced, I don't want to say experienced, but career trainers, if you had clients for more than 5 years over the age of 65, right, you will see that some of them are going from 65 to 70, even seeing them once a week, they don't change a lot. They stay pretty good. They are able to do a little more. You know, hey, I was able to go up and down the stairs 10 times today instead of 5, and that's great. But where they really see the value in you, in most cases, and when they see their peers decreasing in quality, and they go, you know what? I'm not doing as much as I thought I was going to be doing by hiring you, Michelle, but I can see my friend Ramila, she's not doing as well, and I can tell that what I'm doing here is helping keep me the same. I think for those clients, machines like this and potentially shorter duration stimulus, like if you're having a client that's just a half-hour client, or you're only going to do 2 sets of an exercise, I think these machines have a lot of value because you can stimulate them, stress them, have a lot of support. And since it's a matching profile, they tend to feel pretty good, which is one of the reasons why I think so many people are of the Nautilus MedX world, is because those machines feel really good. They do. Super smooth, consistent profiles. But I just want to say, like, as an oversimplified soundbite to make this kind of make sense, is that exercise machines that have matching profiles are really good at helping to build endurance and increase the demand on skeletal muscle, but may not be the most effective for developing strength. And when I say that, maximum performance, external performance, if you will, and there may not be the best thing for hypertrophy as a standalone agent if you have the matching scenario. Now, from an external performance, actually before I go into the strength stuff and the hypertrophy stuff, and we talk about some more practical examples, which are definitely the more fun things. Does anyone have any questions about that little bit? Okay. If anyone does, pipe in or just type a comment. So if we were going to try, let's say that you want to use this machine for hypertrophy. You want to try and grow as much muscle as you possibly can by using just this one machine. There's some pretty good research showing that two things with hypertrophy. One, if you strain the muscle, if you can get a lot of force to the skeletal muscle in the lengthened, in the shortened positions, that the hypertrophy benefits from having a high amount of force in those two positions can yield better hypertrophy results than just challenging it in the mid-range. Now, there was one study that, I'll be honest, there's only one study that I read that talked about this, and they were using the MOXIEs and the oxygen saturation ratios to help measure this. I don't know how effective that is for that, but I do think that's an interesting topic to discuss. It does seem to make sense to me how that if you loaded the muscle at a high level in the shortened position or the lengthened position, high level of force in the two weakest positions, that it could create more hypertrophy. Why would that make sense? Well, we got two things that happen, right? You're loading the skeletal muscle in its weakest position, right? So you're asking it, can you in the weakest position do the most you possibly can? And if you're continuing to repeat that intermittently and you're going into that mechanical damage fatigue scenario, that may not be the safest place to do it. The risk benefit ratio for trying to do that is maybe a little skewed more towards the risk if you're not doing it responsibly and controlled. But you do get this nice benefit, like we were talking about with the Arthur Jones scenario, that it's really heavy at the top and then it kind of drops off and those muscles get to recover a little bit. It takes nanoseconds for ATP and calcium and sodium to be shoved into the muscle to help allow for another contraction to happen to help have a more adequate action potential. We also have that, and I believe it's in Brad Schoenfield's book, that if you can focus on the eccentric portion of the exercise, the muscles a little bit more, the eccentric portion of the exercise is rarely where you see a lot more hypertrophy benefit than the concentric side of it. Again, if we try to rationalize, well, why would the eccentric portion of an exercise have more benefit? You can tolerate way more in parentheses than you can the concentric. What do I mean by more? We talked about this before. Plyometrically, right? If you're deadlifting a 1 rep max, right? I don't say 1 rep max. If you're doing a big weight of some sort, right? You're going to try to concentrically get that thing up as fast as you can because the concentric demand on the body is really high. That's where you get a lot of the burning, a lot of the fatigue, a lot of the, oh, this feels so heavy kind of thing. But you can control the eccentric with 4 times as much time, pretty much with the same amount of effort. It's going to feel different. And this is where a lot of bodybuilding centric routines, they have the tempo numbers of 1, 1, and 4, right? 1 second up, 1 second hold, and then 4 seconds down. You can tolerate a lot more time on the eccentric. You can also tolerate a lot more resistance. With no surprise, if I give you a resistance of any sort, and we say, hey, we're going to do a bicep curl, and I say, hey, Michelle, I want you to bicep curl a 20-pound dumbbell, and you bicep curl that 20-pound dumbbell with no problem, and then I give you a 35 and you can't move it, I know that if I give it to you in your hand, you can control that 35 down with some skeletal muscle control. We just may not call it control because we can't concentrically move it, but you're able to control it with 1 or 2 of the modes, isometrically or eccentrically. So from a hypertrophy end, I think it's kind of cool, more so now, once I've kind of stepped back from the biases I learned from other programs, to look at, hey, if we load the bottom position and we have it kind of lighten off in these positions where I'm a little bit stronger, we focus on one end of the tissue, I can actually manipulate the forces to help me get more out of this exercise in a couple different ways, or just modify my position. So what we're gonna do, I'm tell you what we're gonna do. I'm actually gonna leave this machine for a second. We're gonna come back, we're gonna do pull downs, but we're gonna go to the other side of the room because I got something set up, and we're gonna use just a regular cable exercise before we do the Nautilus machine. So what I've got set up here, I got our Nautilus Freedom, I got the Nautilus Freedom trainer hooked up. Now what I did was I have set up the bands on the bottom. So that way when we're going through this exercise, when I'm pulling on this cable, regardless of the pulley shift, those bands are also picking up some of the slack. Pardon me. The bands are increasing in tension as I go through this displacement. So when I pull this down, no matter what's happening to my joint system, the resistance is continuing to go up because now I am getting more and more of the elastic nature of the band. So right now, I've created a resistance profile. Doesn't really matter what we're about the mechanics right now. We got some bands and some weights, right? If I have 50 pounds, 70 pounds on here, we're gonna call it 70 pounds for today. If I pulled on this without the bands, this is gonna be 70 pounds. Not true, but for today's conversation, 70 pounds, this cable weighs 70 pounds. When I add those bands, now those bands are increasing as resistance as we go up. We've created a scenario, a resistance profile, where it's lighter at the top and heavier at the bottom. No cams required, it's all just the elastics. So talking about trying to create a hypertrophy set, what's really neat about this is if we did something like this machine, a traditional pull down where you have your knees supported. One quick side note, I had somebody sent me a message about this, and as a really quick review, and we talked about this in the pull down section. If I was doing a pull down exercise and I have the knee support, right, you will see some people who will have the knee support and they'll turn around and do the machine backwards. The knee support that goes on top of your thigh is really important when you start doing weights that start to rival your body weight. For example, I'm 190 pounds. I can pull down a lot more than 190 pounds. So what ends up happening is if I put, not true, but 191 pounds on the pull down, what's going to start to happen is if I'm pulling it down, now I have my body starting to be lifted up from the chair a little bit. Right? So that means that I have to now kind of like organize my body, try not to get lifted out of the seat when I'm pulling this thing down. Because once we go past that 190 versus 190, it might as well just be a chin up. And that's fine, but understand there are some limitations between doing a bodyweight chin up and a knee supported pull down. The knee supported pull down takes a lot out of the equation unless you focus more on the upper part. So, any event, hypertrophy. Why is hypertrophy important? Well, if many of us are in these rehab settings or working on much more sensitive demographics, or we have well-conditioned individuals, ultimately, in my opinion, I'm happy to talk about this. I do believe if someone is healthy enough to, we should be working them towards hypertrophy of the things that we're working on. I don't mean necessarily bodybuilding hypertrophy, but volumizing that skeletal muscle so it can tolerate more force, have more endurance, get better, and let them do more of the things they want. I am of the mindset that we should have everybody have the most amount of the muscle on their body that they want and are allowed to, because the more muscle they have, when they start getting older, sarcopenia, loss of muscle, it's going to happen. So if I have an 80-year-old that looks like a bodybuilder and he's cool with it, I'm cool with it too, because I know that those muscles are going to manage a lot more force. So I do think hypertrophy exercises, understanding how hypertrophy happens, is helpful. Anyway, enough yapping. So hypertrophy set. So same kind of thing here. So what I've got now is we've got a profile with my arm. I am relatively strong up here. As I pull this down, I'm getting weaker and weaker down to the bottom. This machine, right? Lighter at the top, heavier at the bottom. We now have profiles, those arcs of force are going different directions. So how can we use this for hypertrophy? Well, already off the bat, when I pull this thing down, the exercise, much like a free weight exercise, like a deadlift or barbell or dumbbell exercise, the exercise is really about the bottom. It really is how well can I get to this bottom position here. So already, generally speaking, an exercise like this setup done with control is going to yield some better hypertrophy benefits than a machine that has a perfectly matching profile. Because as I'm going through this displacement, I'm going to come all the way down to this position here. I'm in my weakest position with the highest amount of force. That means that based off of me being in this position, this is as far as I can go based off of what my muscles can tolerate and with the profile, which is interesting because if I take this away, I have a lot more motion than I can access. But my muscles' ability to produce tension drops off. So here, even if I try to do this as hard as I can, that's as far as I can go. As soon as I take this away, right? Does that make sense? So I have extra motion available, but because the forces, the resistance is going up, my ability to get to that weaker position on my shoulder extensors is, I don't have that ability. So if I wanted to load that very end position, which is a conversation for another day, I'd have to use a lower resistance. But right now, this is as far as I can go. So already an exercise like this from a hypertrophy end is not a bad exercise if we're doing it with control. I keep saying control because this is where you see a lot of folks, and no one here, where they'll do it down fast and they just blast up, and they go down fast and they blast up, and you see them do all this spine motion stuff. So mechanically, if we walk through this, I'm generating tension, I'm pulling this thing down, I'm getting down to the bottom position, my body is using calcium, it's increasing how much force it has to produce all the way down to the bottom position. And when I start eccentrically going up, eccentrically is a little less energetically demanding. Those myosin actin are slowly letting going it up, but because the resistance is decreasing and I'm actually in a position where I don't have that much force, ATP, calcium, sodium, all of the contractile tools that I need are getting flushed back into the muscle, as well as blood and oxygen to help me be prepared for the next contraction. Concurrently, potentiation is happening. And this is where if you've ever seen someone, they're doing a set and they look tired, and then all of a sudden they start speeding up and they get, I don't want to say speed up, but they start looking like it's easier and easier mid-set. Although potentiation literature by Robbins will say that it takes 3 minutes or 12 minutes for it to happen, it can happen pretty quickly in well-conditioned individuals. Not necessarily at the highest level, but it's possible that someone can get, their nervous system can go, oh, we have to make this better now, and start to increase the H reflex and increase, again, more of the substrates to those muscles. Okay, so, all right, so let's say we're gonna take this a little bit further now, right? So generally speaking, performing an exercise like this, not bad for hypertrophy. A lot of things start to happen though. One, range of motion starts to decrease a lot quicker than matching profile exercise. Because since when I start fatiguing, getting to an end range position will start to become more challenging, especially as the resistance goes up. Because keep in mind, we already saw that I could not go to my full end range position of my shoulder extensors because of this profile. So if I start getting weaker or lose the ability to produce force because of fatigue, I may only be able to get to here. This position, though, is not defined by my muscles ability. It's defined by my muscles ability versus the resistance at this time. Because if I take my hand off of this and I had less resistance, I can still get to that end range position. So this is a really thing that I would say I learned from Joe DeAntonis from Pittsburgh, in that if you're doing this any exercise like this, and you start fatiguing, most people, when they can't get to the bottom, they put the machine down and they call it quits. They go, that's the end of the exercise. There's some benefit to that, I would say, but if we want to really try to get as much hypertrophy by reaching concentric fatigue, well, instead of going all the way and just stopping when you can't move it anymore, why not define the exercise by the new endpoint? So your normal motion is your elbow right down to your side. You start fatiguing, you start losing some motion. When you start losing motion, continue the exercise within the motion that you have. And suddenly, you're starting to do what looks like partial reps. But it's really an amazing cascade that you're having, because if you're unable to go any deeper, you are working at your highest ability in now the mid-range position. Now, we are chronologically going through different lengths of different lengths of muscle with different challenge based off of fatigue. So when this exercise at the beginning really only challenged the bottom, now I can challenge the bottom, start to fatigue, challenge the mid-range. When I start fatiguing, challenge the top. And then when I get really tired, I can even just do scapular depression. Now, suddenly, a mismatched profile exercise has actually challenged the muscle through the entire range, which is really cool, but you don't see a lot of people continuing a set like this. Really, and it's actually much more simple. Like, I definitely am using a lot of words to describe this, but what are you doing in essence? You're taking the exercise, you're just going as deep as you can as you start fatiguing, no matter what. And your goal is to take it. You're going to take the exercise set all the way until you can't move it anymore, concentrically, and then that's it. So how could you do this with other exercises? Well, we'll come back to the pull down, but very easily, right? Bicep curls are a very easy example. This is the one that Joe used, right? If I'm doing a bicep curl exercise, right? Most people go, okay, well, this is as high as I'm going. Well, if I can't get to here, why not just go to the range that I can control? Why not go just the bottom half? So what I'm not advocating for is that you have to do partials exclusively. It really is that you can mechanically stimulate the entire range much more strategically with even higher resistance in some cases with a profile that mismatches. From a barbell exercise perspective, I mean, when I don't work with a lot, it's been a while since I've worked with bodybuilders and professional athletes, but when I was working more with, like down in Toronto, we had a lot of bodybuilders and a lot of guys that we did consulting for, which was really cool. And when you have people talk, well, I'm going to come back to this machine, so I'm not going to go too far, right? When you have someone who's doing a barbell exercise and you want to work on hypertrophy, the craziest thing and the most exhausting thing is if they're squatting down to 90 degrees and back up, and when they have a hard time getting out of 90 degrees, they stop. From a powerlifting strength perspective, that could have some merit. But if you're talking about hypertrophy and getting full ownership of the concentric in all the positions, well, why not transition to partials? Why not transition to the relative partial that you can control? So I'm not saying that there's a specific range, but if you go down to 90 degrees and you start getting tired, what you could easily do is just go down to, instead of parallel to the ground, 70 degrees relative to the ground, and then go to 45 degrees and actually do defined sets in those ranges. It's the same kind of idea. So you are right? And this is coming back to the equation that you guys have heard so many times. You are modifying the motions strategically based off of the resistance and how your muscles are performing right now. So I think is a really cool idea. And for most clients, if you've never done this with them, they're going to think they're going to hate it because it's so exhausting on the muscles. They will feel sensations they haven't felt before. Now, what I'm not telling you to do is you're not kicking their butt. But again, if we're on the hypertrophy side of things, we want to be as efficient as possible. And we want to try to get them to that concentric mechanical fatigue, potentially small sacroplasmic, skeletal, myofibril, a little bit of trauma. So we do have that genesis that needs to happen in those muscles. You want to get this thing as close to fatigue as you can in a controlled way. This is a great way to do something like that. Now, on the other end of the equation, we can, well, first and foremost, before I go to the next thing, does anyone have any questions about that? Does that make sense? Okay. I would urge, if you guys are listening to this today, I would 100% urge you, if you haven't tried these, try it. Take your favorite exercise and do lab time. Because if you experiment with this, you may not like how it feels for your program. It may not necessarily give you the results that you want. But if you have a client who's coming for you for the hypertrophy experience, this is a very valuable thing to go, hey, you're going to do what you normally do in the gym. We're going to do two things. We're going to slow it down a little, and we're going to modify the range as you start getting tired. So when you can't get to that end range, the exercise isn't done. We're going to keep going until you cannot move it, but we're going to do it with control. Now, the other side of the equation, talking about still concentric fatigue with machines, and then we'll go back to the other machine, is with something like this, without doing very much different, we can actually modulate tempo to get more out of the muscles, right? What do we know when we go faster that we have been told, even by me, to steer far away from? If you use too much acceleration, you're going to build up kinetic energy and momentum, inertia, and you're going to be able to get you're going to blast through a range of an exercise without getting all the stimulation and the tension through the muscles. Absolutely. And generally speaking, most exercisers in the gym blast through ranges and don't get the most out of the exercise. But what if we use it just like a carpenter as a tool? What if we can recognize that as, okay, so there's a mode that most of us can go to. It's a very efficient mode. We're going to use acceleration. So what am I talking about? It's the same kind of thing. I still got the bands hooked up. I'm going through this exercise. Now, perhaps I'm starting to lose the ability to get to the end range position. Well, what if I, on purpose, try to actually throw it down and use controlled acceleration to get some of that kinetic energy to help overcome the weight stack? Now, keep in mind, when I've talked about this in other programs, and I've talked about this in classes, right? We talked about how pulley systems like this one decrease the inertia. They absolutely do. But what also has inertia that can help? Our body and our limbs. So if I'm up in this position, very low moment, very low amount of torque relative to the bottom, and I accelerate down, I can actually use my arm mass to actually give me some inertia, help me get to the end range position, and then control up the eccentric. Now, this is interesting because there's a whole continuum of acceleration that we can do, right? And this is where, if you guys have seen around this gym, or you've seen Charlie McMillan, if you set up a scale like 5%, 25%, 50%, and you educate a client, you go, hey, Michelle, I want you to go pull it down as fast as you can, 100% effort. Okay, great, good. Now pull it down with 5% effort. Cool, 25%, 50%, 75%. You can teach them different levels of acceleration. And now you can use that strategically. So you're going 5% speed, starting to fatigue, now go a little faster down, control it up, 50% down, slow it up. But what are we doing to, what level, what kind of muscular fatigue are we actually getting into when we do this? Well, now we're starting to add more emphasis on the isometric control side of things, and even the plyometric isometric side of things, right? Because we've got two different types of isometrics. We've got the myometric isometric, where I'm trying to pull down and I'm trying to shorten the muscle, but the object will not let me. And then there's the plyometric isometric, where I have something that is trying to beat me and I'm trying to keep it still, right? We can tolerate a lot of force this way. So when I do, does that distinction make sense? Okay, so when I'm doing an accelerated toss to catch the exercise, right? What's happening is I'm accelerating to overcome the resistance on the concentric side of things, which I've already fatigued. Then I'm catching it at the bottom. I'm catching it at the bottom, which means that there is some plyometric or eccentric force that I have to manage, which means if I do this and I catch it, it's very likely, like we've seen many times with fish scales, that if this 70 pounds comes down fast and I catch it, then I'm going to get a small jolt of more than 70 pounds in this position that I have to manage. And this is where you might see people throw it down. You might see something like this, right? That kind of like, and it kind of comes up and they catch it, right? So now we're entering into the fatigue realm of the plyometric side of things. So that first exercise where you're doing the modified range, I think that's a very safe entry point into hypertrophy land, because you're still demonstrating all that control. You're still demonstrating. Now, please, I will say this too, like very simply, and I'm not going to go through these examples. We could easily do a drop set by taking these bands off, right? Like I got 3 green bands on there. I can take 1 off, 2 off, 3 off, 70 pounds, 50 pounds. Those are kind of traditional drop sets. And I think those are really great too. We could also do positional changes, but we'll save that for another day. Ooh, sharp thing in the hand. There we go. So now if we go back to the Nautilus Nitro pull down and we talk about how to hypertrophy it a little bit, we can take, if this is our sole tool, we can use this strategically, right? Because what did we see last week with this machine? What did we even see this week, right? We saw that when I'm pulling this thing down, it's heavier at the top and it gets lighter at the bottom. Cool. Okay. Enough review with that. We also know that there's a lot of research showing that if we can stress out the shortened position with a high amount of force and control, and I can do more on the eccentric side of things, I can get potentially more hypertrophy and a more efficient stimulus on these muscles to get the adaptations that I want. So what did we see last week again? Well, we also saw that if I don't have this 90-degree angle and I'm actually pulling in this way, I'm actually now battling the material of the machine. So the resistance is going up, but the amount of weight isn't. The resistance is going up, but the weight isn't. Because at this angle with the 90 degrees of this machine, I have an efficient lever arm that lines up with the tangent of the lever. When I come in here, I am now battling that and now pulling some of the weight back into the machine. So how could I use that strategically, right? We saw that last week and it was like, well, we got to avoid that. Well, what if we don't, right? What if I pull this thing down, it gets lighter in the bottom, and then I lean forward a little bit and I push my hands forward in that shortened position, right? So what's happening? So heavier here, gets lighter at the bottom. I'm going to lean forward and I'm going to exaggerate. I'm going to push my hands forward. What's going to happen is when I push my hands forward, now I'm going to have the battling of the machine that happens, which is going to increase the resistance at the shortened position. And if I keep pushing my pinky fingers forward and I come all the way up, now I'm increasing the resistance as much as I can on that eccentric side of things. This is kind of cool because now what we have happening is we've got this wonderful profile that gets us all the way down to the bottom position. And then I shove forward with some force that helps me to overload the shoulder extensors by increasing distance to the shoulder and increasing resistance by the machine, pushing back into the axis of the machine and then having to control it up. Now, the way I'm doing it, it looks ridiculous. And you would not, to be honest, if you're doing this, you're not even going to notice it really. Like if I actually did this with a weight that would give me a similar experience, I pull down, I lean forward, and I keep pushing forward as I go back up, right? Leaning back to get that 90-degree angle, pushing my hands forward, and then controlling it up. You might notice that shift now that we're talking about it, but if you were in your gym and you experimented with a resistance that met your level with an exercise like this or any other selector machine, you shouldn't really notice a difference visually, but you will feel a difference. And I do urge you, next time you're in here, sorry, I've got 5 more minutes. When you're in here or you're at your gym, Michelle, you have a machine like this with a sagittal grip, pull it down, push your hands forward a little, and then keep pushing your hands forward as much as you can into the wall of resistance and to control it all the way up. I do believe that there's some really cool exercises that we can create sensation-wise from the intention experience by pushing on bars, but many of them may not necessarily be effective for a hypertrophy and or strength goal. It's just going to create different directions of force, which from a configuration perspective or rehab perspective or increasing mobility perspective can be really great. Here's what I mean by that, so it doesn't sound like I'm just, right? So if I take an exercise like this, if I take my hands and I try to pull inward or I try and pull back, I can create some really interesting experiences, which for the sake of strategic variation are great. But this machine and the direction of this force vector that's designed here, it's more designed to do shoulder extension. So is there any way that I can learn more about the modes of contraction we talked about today and modify the direction I'm shoving on this thing to get more out of this machine? So in this scenario, all I'm trying to do in this case is overload. I hate overload. Add more force to the eccentric. So coming all the way down, drop off on the bottom, shoving my hands forward, continuing to shove my hands forward, and then all the way up. Now here's what's nice about this from the hypertrophy end. Once I start fatiguing from that experience shoving forward, as a second part of this to continue the set, I can just stop. I can just perform the exercise as is, because what's going to happen is 2 things. I've already I've fatigued the eccentric component. So now I can just continue the exercise as it is without doing any sort of intention differences. And same with the other side of same with the other exercise. as a third part of this, once I start fatiguing, I can just go to the range that I can control. And so this very quickly becomes a three-tiered mechanically modified set that lets you take one set a lot further than just performing one set traditionally. So if you're watching this recording, what I would like for you to do, now you don't need the Nautilus Nitro pull down, but here hey. Here, I want to go over. So here's a piece of homework to make this more practical for everyone, because I want these next few examples over the next few weeks to be as practical as possible. So find a pull down machine wherever you go. It doesn't need to be a Nautilus Nitro. It could be the pull down on the other side of the room. It could be a traditional cable pull down. But I would suggest,
Brandon, gyms are closed. Where do we find the pull down machine?
Sorry, Anna. So, Anna, I'll tell you what, if you want to come in and experiment with this here, you are more than welcome
I'm
to.
still quarantining for another week.
Okay, so when you get to a gym, I'm sorry, Anna, I will get you to experience this. But what I want you, anyone who's watching this, wherever you can experience, if you're a part of the Strata team, you guys are more than welcome to come here when you're not quarantining. 3 steps. Find a pull down machine. I would prefer for you to find a sagittal grip pull down, not one of the really wide ones, because that starts to get kind of weird. You're going to do 3 sets in a row at the same time. So the first set is the eccentric focused pull down. So you're going to take that same pull down, like we just talked about, you're going to pull it down to the bottom position. You're going to shove your hands forward to focus on that eccentric part. And as you're going up eccentrically, continue to shove your pinky fingers forward all the way to the lengthened position. Stop pushing your pinky fingers forward. Pull it all the way in, bottom position, pinky fingers forward, control all the way back up. Take that exercise until you start getting tired without taking your hands off of the handles. The second part of it is just perform the exercise as you normally would. No unique forces, no big changes, just going through the full excursion, owning the bottom. The third part is when you start fatiguing and you lose the ability to get to the bottom of the exercise, practice going through all the different ranges that you can control based off of fatigue. And they may look very small and Mickey Mouse, but once you take this exercise through each of these 3 sequences, you'll really feel a very different sensation in those muscles. And what I would urge for you to do is try this in as many different scenarios as you possibly can with a pull down. You can do this with a row too, right? If you've got a rowing machine, in fact, Anna, this takes a little more creativity, but if you're doing a barbell row, right, you can do the same thing by rowing, but just pushing your hands back into extension a little bit on the eccentric. So you pull it, am I in the camera? There we go. You pull it up, extend back a little bit with the barbell, control down. Don't pull back, pull it up, extend back, and pull down. I'm exaggerating my technique a little bit. My back's not super happy doing that, but experiment. Chest supported machine. Any of these back machines, just shove into extension for that eccentric focus. And experiment. But see, what I'm trying to do is we're trying to do a couple things here, is we're taking a combination of all of these elements and taking it a little further. Now, I'll tell you what, actually, if you want to add one more element, and then I've got to button this up, you can make it a 4-step one, taking the other thing that we talked about on the other side, the acceleration, right? So same thing. I'll just talk through this as a 4-set challenge, right? Pull down or row, eccentric focus. When you get tired, perform your normal cadence pull down. Make sure you have a defined tempo. So that's set 2. Set 3, use some of that acceleration to control it down, control it to the bottom position, and then eccentric up. Acceleration, eccentric up, right? Just helping you get to the shortened position. When that starts getting tired, then modify the set to the modify and range sets. From a practical perspective, all of these things that you learn from myself and other fancy exercise professionals, it has to be practical. It has to be logically practical. And so what a really cool way is to take all of these things and go, okay, if I have 5 different ways of doing a pull down on a machine from a hypertrophy end, which there are other things to talk about, most of us talk about it in rehab settings. I have that bias too. From a performance end, how many different ways can you modulate this thing? So if you have a professional hockey player come in, a bodybuilder, a fitness person, or you have one of your less conditioned people that really you think is great to work on hypertrophy, you can take one of these 4 things and stack 2 of them together, or stack 4 of them together to create a really unique experience. So what's cool about this too is now you have 4 different ways to do the pull down. So you can either do 4 different ways. You can do A and B, you can do B and C, you can do C and D, you can try and do D, right? You can mix and match these things all different ways. And if you've ever heard me say this before, I believe that when you learn enough variations of an exercise like this, you should be able to have a client come in and do the same machine every week and go, wow, this feels totally different each week. And you really should. And I would urge you, if you're like, well, I don't know, this is how you do that, right? That's just 4 variations. And there are a lot of other things that we can do on something just like this. So please, to end off the year, where you can, experiment with things like this. I would say for yourself as lab time, think of it on the hypertrophy end. Pick a resistance that you can do between 8 and 12 repetitions or even more reps. So you can really feel the changes in fatigue and have fun. And maybe you don't like it, that's cool. Experience it and then share it along with somebody else. But try to understand the concept. So if you see, for example, anyone else online doing something like this, you can go, oh, I know what you're doing. You're taking these things, you're squishing them together, and you're making your own chocolate cake. So, Happy New Year, everybody.
Happy New Year, guys.
Happy New Year.
So next Wednesday, it is the 2-hour business-focused study group. I have a couple different ideas, but I'm going to be writing some stuff in the Microsoft Teams account. So please let me know if you have a specific direction you want to go. I think continuing the social media conversation, but also doing some annual business goal conversations are some good things to do as well. So we can do all that, and I'd love your feedback on this. But I'll have this video up. It will be tomorrow, just with the way how things are shaping up today. But thank you so much for your time. I would say when you watch this or you're listening to it, go and experiment, please. It's the lab time that you'll get the most out of it. Got to experiment. Bye, everybody. Thanks for your time. See you next year.
Thank you, Brandon.
Bye.